Okay, so let's get into the content of the 2025 IRP. And since a lot of the IRP in some ways is ultimately kind of a determination of Georgia Power's resource mix, I thought we'd start with Georgia Power's resource mix. So on the left, you see the installed capacity forecasted to 2025. On the right, what you see is a 2024 energy mix. And just to kind of remind folks, so why those are different, the capacity mix is the nameplate capacity of the resources that Georgia Power either owns or has under long-term contract versus the actual energy they produce. One way to kind of tell that difference is nuclear is 12% of the capacity, but 29% of generation, because nuclear units run most of the hours of the year. Likewise, solar and storage is 14% of the capacity, but 6% of the energy mix. Typically, I think Georgia Power has put its forecasted energy mix, but I didn't see that, at least in the main filing this time. Georgia Power, quickly I'll go through kind of the process. We've talked about this, and you've actually seen this image in a prior presentation, but just kind of remind folks of the process. One of the first basic steps in the IRP is Georgia Power will establish its reliability criteria, and that really equates to their target reserve margin. Then they forecast their load and capacity needs, and then they put those two together. When you put the target reserve margin on top of the forecasted load, that determines Georgia Power's energy needs going out into the future. Then they'll compare those energy needs to what they currently have. So compare that to the resources that they have either owned or under long-term contract. And what you will see is actually some of the need in part happens because some of those long-term power purchase agreements are expiring in the future. And so once they've done that, that begins to identify what will their future capacity needs be if they have them, and in what years will they arise. And then they do expansion modeling process that we talked about, where they'll look at what are available resources, and then they run their expansion model to determine what is the optimal resource mix for the company. What are the right generating units and what volumes to have to create the least cost total mix of resources. And then there's some additional modeling looking at production cost modeling that they do toward the end. All right, and as they do this, they consider scenarios. And I think in an earlier session where I talked about this, I joked about Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns. But this is to kind of look at the things that they are uncertain about. So there are certain things when they look out into making projections that they realize that there's uncertainty around. And the main ones that they focus on is whether or not there'll be carbon constraints. What is the cost and the performance of different technologies? What will the actual load growth be on their system? And then finally, what will be the cost of fuel? And so they introduce this process of planning with these scenarios where they test these different scenarios. And so what you might see is they have low fuel cost, moderate, high. Those are the variables there. And so I want to say something. One of the key things is that Georgia Power has integrated throughout this the 111 greenhouse gas rules. So that's 111B and 111D. Those were finalized last year in the spring of 2024. And so the first three scenarios assume that the greenhouse gas rules, the 111 rules, are in place and remain in place, and the other 6 scenarios are assuming that they do not remain in place, because they are being litigated, so it's a question of whether or not they will be in place in the future. And I want to say one thing. Typically, in my experience, Georgia Power would identify what we might call the base scenario. What scenario are they actually planning on? And then they introduce the variables as things to consider. And I don't think they've really said, I didn't see necessarily identification of a base scenario, but the base scenarios really are the 111, you see the label out there on the right side, 111 medium gas 0, and then medium gas 0 number 5. I think those are the two that they present modeling results most for. Okay. This graph and the next one probably tells kind of the central story of the 2025 IRP. That is Georgia Power's projected winter peak demand over the planning horizon, and the light blue line at the bottom is what they projected in the 2022 IRP. Then they came back 18 months later and they did their 2023 IRP update. That's the darker blue line. And then the red line is what they currently forecast for their winter peak demand going forward in the 2025 IRP. And I guess I want to emphasize, you're talking about an industry that for the most part has seen relatively flat or declining load growth for 15 years or more. These are tremendous, this is tremendous load growth that Georgia Power is forecasting. Most of this is associated with large loads, and most of those large loads are data centers. So a lot of this increase is driven by new projected large loads, most of them data centers. And I'll say quickly, Georgia Power does its modeling in 2 stages. The first one is what they've traditionally done, which they now, I think, call their organic load growth, or traditional, I don't remember, they have a name for it, which is basically regression modeling. They look back in time and they say, what did economic, growth look like? How many customers did we have in the past? And what was load growth, or what was load like then? And they use that to forecast into the future. And that's what they've typically done. Now, because they've had these very large loads coming into Georgia and coming onto the system, there isn't really a historic record that helps them understand what that looks like. And when I talk about large loads, we're talking about huge loads, really. A single load that might be 500 megawatts or even 1,000 megawatts, that's the size of a small city. And that's a single customer. So what they've added is a probabilistic model looking at the probability that these large loads will come to Georgia, first select it, then they're going to buy land and begin developing that land. That they're going to, and remember, they can actually bid out their power service. So one additional kind of, what's the probability that they'll actually select Georgia Power to be their utility provider? And so they kind of combine those two, the organic load growth and the probabilistic load growth model, to come up with the current load growth forecast. And so here is, I know there's kind of a lot going on this slide, but think of this going left to right is less probable going to more certain. And I think the real number to pay attention to is this 8 gigawatts of committed large loads. And so Georgia Power has 8 gigawatts of loads that have signed commitments to take electric service from Georgia Power by, I think this is looking out through mid-2030s. That's a huge number. Their current system peak demand is less than 16 gigawatts. So that's basically adding, that's as much as adding 50% to the total system demand. Okay. So this is from the Load and Energy Forecast. This is their forecast of retail sales, and I thought it'd be useful to put this into a graph. Give me one second, let me finish. Just so you can kind of get a sense of what does this mean realistically by customer class, and what you really see is fairly flat forecasted retail sales for the residential sector, that's in blue, and then slightly increasing retail sales for industrial, and just tremendous increase in sales for the commercial sector. All right, so let's talk about target reserve margin. I hope folks will remember target reserve margin is that sort of extra margin, the cushion that Georgia Power needs to plan for to maintain reliability on the system. So they basically, in the very simplest term, what is their peak demand forecasted load growth, and then they add on top of that to have additional reserves. The point of the target reserve margin is twofold. What if their forecast wasn't quite right? And then also, what if their estimation of what resources they have to meet the load isn't quite right? One example would be, what if a nuclear unit trips offline, you just lost 1,000 megawatts of load serving capacity, you need to be able to deal with that kind of thing. So target reserve margin is kind of a balancing effort. You're balancing as you could have perfect reliability if you want to go all the way out here, or really, really good reliability. But by doing that, you're also going to have tremendous costs that people are going to, and that's the green bar. You would have that additional carrying cost for customers, whereas if you don't have enough, this red bar, the cost of unserved energy, is higher. So it's a sort of balancing act, finding the optimal economic reserve margin. Georgia Power traditionally has had a 16.25 summer target reserve margin and a 26% winter reserve margin. In this docket, they are asking to maintain their winter reserve margin at 26, but raise their summer target reserve margin to 20%. And as part of that, they've said that won't drive additional capacity needs, at least in the foreseeable future. Okay, the demand side management plan, and we're going to talk more deeply about this later, so I'm going to kind of cover it cursory. Part of what the IRP is that they file a demand side management plan. Is it more effective, for instance, for them to save the electricity than build the new resources to meet that load? They have filed 4 cases, as they call it. There's the proposed case, and that is what Georgia Power is proposing to the Public Service Commission to adopt. Sort of, and we'll talk more about that. Advocacy case, which is a case that's designed by folks who participate in the demand side management working group process. The supply side case and the capacity and affordability case are new. I'm gonna have to hurry up, okay. And supply side case is they agreed to model demand side management like a supply side resource. So they put it in their expansion model, make it behave like a natural gas unit. How much would the expansion model select in the process? So that's a supply side case, and this is a new way of looking at energy efficiency for Georgia Power. And the capacity and affordability case is a new case that they filed that they haven't filed in the past. Largely the reason being is for them to meet this proposed case, they say, is so expensive for customers that we want to give the Public Service Commission an alternative. And I should have said something right away, which I forgot to say. This case was designed to hit a performance benchmark of 0.75% savings compared to their retail sales. So that's a common way of benchmarking utility demand-side management performance. We're going to talk more about that. And that was something Georgia Power agreed to do in the Vogel stipulation. And so in part what they're saying, I think it's fair to say, is we've agreed to hit 0.75%. That about doubles their current performance from where they are now. And they're saying that is just very, very, very expensive for us to do. And so we've introduced a 4th case for the commissioners to consider. All right, supply side plan. I've broken it kind of in 6 buckets. First is Bowen 1 and 4. Bowen units 1 and 4 are coal units up in Bartow County. The total capacity of Bowen 1 through 4 is about 3,300 megawatts, big coal plant. There was no formal retirement decision about any of the Bowen units, but they were under consideration for retirement and discussion. And so there was discussion that they may actually propose retiring 2 of the units anyway, but what they're proposing is to operate those units now all the way through 2038, so keep them operational. Now, likewise, they did actually file retirement requests, and they were approved for Share Unit 3, that it would have retired in 2028, and they're now asking for that to be extended to 2038. Share Unit 3 is a coal unit. Gaston 1 through 4 and Unit A, likewise, they had proposed retiring, and those are natural gas units, natural gas steam units specifically, and they're proposing to extend the operation of those. And what you see in the brackets up top is how many megawatts they think they can get from those extensions. So as I said, that's 3,300 megawatts, but it never had been proposed retirement. They think they can preserve about 1,000 megawatts by making those extensions. They want to upgrade a series of natural gas and nuclear units. So McIntosh 10 through 11, those are natural gas combined cycle units. McIntosh 1A through 8A are combustion turbines. And then Hatch and Vogel 1 and 2, those are nuclear units. And so they're proposing to upgrade these units, refurbish them, and they think they can get an additional 380 megawatts of capacity. Hydro upgrades, they did start a modernization. I think they have about 60 plus units altogether in their hydro fleet. They started a modernization of a select number of those units. I think that was actually in the 2019 IRP, they got approval for that. And now they're coming back and proposing to upgrade the remainder of the fleet. So 42 units and 9 plants, and they can get more than 660 megawatts from that. This is a wholesale to retail offer. when Georgia Power has a plant, but it's actually selling that capacity, say, to an out-of-state utility under a wholesale contract, there are some of those units, when those contracts expire, it's Georgia Power's practice to then turn to the Public Service Commission and offer those units for retail service. And so they are offering 187 megawatts of share unit 3 that was under long-term capacity to other utilities for that to serve retail customers. And then we'll talk more about the flex procurement, but they're proposing ways to make the procurement of renewable energy more flexible so that they could get up to, I think their total target would be 4,000 megawatts of renewable energy. Okay, so let's talk about renewable procurement. And I'm going to say right now that I'm going to do my best to interpret the current IRP filing. I do have remaining questions. I admit that it isn't entirely clear to me how it's all going to work, and I've talked to some other people. Okay, so I'm going to do my best. They are going to propose, so utility scale procurement and a distributed generation procurement. Utility scale will be the bulk of it, the distributed generation, a much smaller slice. The utility scale, they would do there would be phases or tranches, and this is where it gets a little hazy, but this is my best interpretation. They will procure 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy, and that will be made available to all customers. So just like any other resource on the system. Then they will begin procurement of renewable resources for customer subscription. And so that's CARES program and CRISP, if folks are familiar, where customers can subscribe to get renewable energy from the company. And they're going to do this in tranches where they will do a first tranche and then they will leave the RFP open. And I think there will be 2 additional tranches. In the second tranche, if you, as a bidder, weren't selected, your project, you can actually then buy down the price and then get selected. And I presume, if I understand it, that means as a bidder, you would probably go negotiate with a customer one-to-one and say, are you willing to pay me money to buy down the price and I'll put it back into the RFP? And then finally, the last kind of tranches would be open where customers can actually work directly with developers, develop a project and get that bid into the process and get it selected by the power company. That's my best understanding at this point. I think we'll get more clarity hopefully on Friday. The distributed generation is just 100 megawatts. So by the way, so this would get all the way up to 1,000 megawatts, but with the capacity to, the possibility of procuring an additional 3,000. So 4,000 megawatts total. This is much smaller. Distributed generation is 2 procurements, each 50 megawatts for a total of 100. So there's a lot of, and I should say, they're building in additional flexibility. Customers who have wanted to subscribe to the programs have had difficulties in the past, and I think they're trying to make an effort to make it more flexible, keep it open, and meet that customer demand for like large commercial customers that want to, say, buy clean energy through Georgia Power. And I think there is a new residential distributed generation community solar where they'll reserve the first 10 megawatts of each of the procurements for distributed generation and make that available for residential customers to buy as a community solar program. How much time I got? Am I out of time? 2.5. All right, I think we can cover the last. Customer resiliency programs. We've talked maybe a little bit about this. Georgia Power has introduced, particularly starting with the 2022, then 2023 IRP, various customer resiliency programs. I'm going to cover the middle one kind of first. And so those are, for instance, I'll just give you an example. They will buy and install a generator behind your meter. And that generator, and this is usually for very large customers, that is available if the lights go out, the system goes down, you have that as backup. But otherwise, the Georgia Power can call that generator when they have system needs. They could take you offline, for instance, transfer you to your generator, or even bring energy back across your meter. So they have different forms of that. They proposed 2 in the 2022 IRP. They added 2 ones in the 2023 IRP, and they're adding a new large customer-owned resiliency program. And then the solar plus storage pilot, I'm not going to talk too much about this because we're about to hear James Riley give an in-depth presentation on that. But this is typically what people would call virtual power plant programs, and Georgia Power did agree to explore this, and they held some meetings, and they have come forth with a proposal for a solar plus battery storage pilot program. 50 megawatts of total capacity, and there's 2 kind of participation pathways, and James will cover this. I got 1 minute, so I'm gonna let James cover that. And then V2X pilot is a vehicle to everything, so where there's all these vehicles out there, and so that's really kind of a storage capacity. And so is there a way to make that storage available for the grid and for resiliency purposes on the grid? So they're gonna run a pilot with, I think, some public school systems that have chargers for their buses about whether they can use that storage for grid resiliency. Okay, and then last things, transmission plan. As I said, the IRP contains their 10-year transmission plan. That is a plan that they do as part of the integrated transmission system. So transmission in Georgia is jointly owned by Georgia Power, the Georgia Transmission Corporation, which basically represents the co-ops, MEAG and Dalton Utilities. Those are also the folks that kind of co-own the nuclear units. They own the transmission system together. So that plan is is the forecast for the 10-year plan for the integrated transmission system. They have their environmental compliance plan, and I think the 2 things I would highlight in that, one is that they're focused on the 111 greenhouse gas rules. That's clearly a concern on the environmental compliance plan is really how will they meet customer demand, maintain reliability, while also meeting all applicable environmental rules. And so one of them is that they're focused on is the 111 greenhouse gas rules, and the other is the effluent limitation guidelines. There's a new rule, and that's for wastewater from particularly coal plants, and how are they going to meet that, particularly as they now propose, for instance, to keep Bowen open for another, however many, 12 years. How will they meet the ELG rules? And then, of course, I think just an important piece of that is they will continue their plan for coal ash cleanup, what sometimes is called their coal combustion residual obligation. So that is a very big deal, just so folks understand that. That's, I think, more than $9 billion they'll spend on coal ash cleanup over about a 40-year span. So that plan's in place, and they continue to go forward with that. And then finally, the additional sums. I won't spend a lot of time, but Georgia Power is allowed an earnings mechanism for when they enter long-term power purchase agreements, which most of the renewable energy is procured that way. Also, when they do demand-side management options, they get an earnings mechanism. And they're also asking for an earning mechanism for those resiliency programs we talked about. So that's new. And they have proposed changes to those earning mechanisms, I think, for all 3 of those. Certainly one is new. They've changed their request for the additional sum for demand-side management. And then they also are requesting additional sum for all of their renewables procurement. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Cody. I think it's going to